Hi, my name is Brianna Goya, and I will be doing my project on trauma and PTSD in relation to Native American children. What interested me about the topic? I've always known that the Native American population has suffered greatly over many generations, but I did not realize the true magnitude of it until I took a Native American literature course. In the screenplay Moon and Two Windows by Scott Momaday, the main part of the story took place in the Indian boarding school. A lot of trauma occurred to the children that went to these schools, and it spans generations. In history and throughout the course itself, trauma and the effects that trauma have been a constant factor. Because of my major and interest in psychology, I wanted to look deeper into the effects that trauma and PTSD has on the lives of Native American children. The second area of interest I have in connection to this topic is the Western treatments compared to the Native treatments for PTSD and trauma. What is PTSD? PTSD, otherwise known as post-traumatic stress disorder, is a psychiatric disorder that may occur in people that have witnessed or experienced a traumatic event. PTSD can also be linked to historical and intergenerational trauma. Connection to literature. In the screenplay Moon and Two Windows, the character Luther states while being taken from his family to go to the boarding school, "Always we Indian people have loved our children above all else. I did not know it then, but I do now, that it was the most hurtful thing, the worst thing imaginable, the giving up of the children." The terror and trauma that these children faced in the Indian boarding schools was horrific and caused many to have PTSD. One of the famous quotes regarding the Indian boarding schools was, "Kill the Indian to save the man." This essentially meant that in order for a Native American to be acceptable, then everything about their identity and culture had to be erased. On page 143 in the screenplay, the children are being forced to cut their hair, which is a major part of their culture. The character Plenty Horses fights back, as if his life was on the line. Plenty Horse is an explosion of his whole body, breaks the orderly's hold, whirls, and throws the orderly to the floor. In the same motion, he grabs the barber's scissors and holds the point to the orderly's throat. As a child, to fight as though it's a life or death situation, it's extremely traumatizing. Statistics. Alaska Native and American Indian youth experience trauma at higher rates than other youth in the U.S. population. According to a report by the Indian Country Child Trauma Center, Native youth are 2.5 times more likely to experience trauma compared to their non-Native peers. A report from the Attorney General's Advisory Committee on Alaska Native and American Indian Children Exposed to Violence noted that Alaska Native and American Indian juveniles experience post-traumatic stress disorder at 22%, which is the same rate as veterans returning from Afghanistan or Iraq. This rate is also triple the rate of the general population. Research also displays high rate of behavioral health concerns in relation to the trauma, such as substance abuse, alcoholism, mental health disorders, violence, and suicide. Trauma is a major link to suicide, which disproportionately affects Native American population. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for those 10 to 35 and is 1.5 times higher than the national average. Traumas in Native history. Historical trauma. The concept of historical trauma is multi-layered instead of being centered on a sole individual. The theory of historical trauma can be broken into three parts. The first part of the dominant culture causing mass traumas on a population, resulting in familiar, cultural, economic, and societal devastation for the population. The second part of the theory is when the original generation of that particular population responds to trauma and then shows societal, biological, and physical symptoms. The final part of the theory is when those initial responses to trauma are conveyed to future generations through psychological and environmental factors, as well as discrimination and prejudice. Intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is the unconscious and intergenerational grief from the historical trauma that Native people experience. It is passed from generation to generation because of land disposition, forced relocation, the loss of spiritual practices, culture, and language. Things such as depression, PTSD, substance abuse, and anxiety can be outward manifestations of unresolved historical grief and trauma. PTSD Diagnostic Info Description. A doctor that has experience assisting people with mental illnesses, such as a psychiatrist, can diagnose an individual with PTSD. In order to be diagnosed with PTSD, an individual must have all of the following for at least 1 month: at least one re-experiencing symptom, at least one avoidance symptom, at least 2 arousal and reactivity symptoms, and at least 2 cognition and mood symptoms. So a re-experiencing symptom include flashbacks, bad dreams, or frightening thoughts. Avoidance symptoms include staying away from places, events, or objects that are all reminders of the traumatic experience, or avoiding thoughts or feelings related to the traumatic event. Arousal and reactivity symptoms include being easily startled, feeling tense or on edge, having difficulty sleeping, having angry outbursts. Cognition and mood symptoms include trouble remembering key features of the traumatic event, negative thoughts about oneself or the world, distorted feelings like guilt or blame, or loss of interest in enjoyable activities. Genetics in relation to trauma. Genetics play a very large role in response to trauma. According to Harvard.edu, research evidence clearly suggests a predisposition or susceptibility for developing PTSD that is hereditary in nature, with 30% of PTSD cases explained by genetics alone. And right here we just have an image of pre-trauma factors going to post-trauma factors, which lead to PTSD. Effects on cognitive development. PTSD dysregulates the serotonin system. Disruptions in serotonin's regulatory functioning are connected to several psychopathical disorders that are common in adults and children with childhood trauma. For example, decreased levels of serotonin activity have been associated with mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, as well as aggressive behaviors in individuals with personality disorders like borderline personality disorder. Memory problems. Brain structures associated with memory consolidation have been found to differ in adults that report a history of abuse. Adults with a history of abuse have been shown to have a smaller hippocampal volume. This area of the brain is associated with memory consolidation. In comparison with non-abused children, children with abuse-associated PTSD may show less effective activation of this area of the brain during a memory recall task. Metacognitive skills. Neuropsychological research suggests that children who experience physical abuse and neglect may experience problems in cognitive flexibility and auditory attention. General language and cognitive delay. Studies show that children that have experienced PTSD have a lower verbal IQ, suggesting that the presence of PTSD is in fact relevant. Here we have a healthy child brain on the left compared to a abused child's brain on the right. And you can tell there's a very, very big difference in those. Effects on the social, emotional, and physical development. The oxytocin system is affected. It plays an important role in interpersonal relationships as well as the regulation of the body's response to stress. Experiencing negative life events can disrupt the body's regulation of oxytocin. Biases in the processing of social emotional information. In this, the amygdala has been shown to be over-responsive to emotional stimuli in studies of abused children. These children are also found to have a reduced thickness in the brain, in the area of the brain that is mainly responsible for processing social information. The last one is the stress hormone dysregulation. Trauma is commonly described as a leading hyperarousal of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Simply described is the relationship between trauma and the stress hormone system. This results in changes in the brain's development. Right here we just have a little wrap-up of everything we just discussed on how childhood trauma impacts cognition, physical health, emotions, relationships, mental health, behavior, and brain development. Western treatments. The cognitive processing therapy focuses on modifying painful negative emotions and beliefs due to the trauma. Therapists help the person confront such distressing memories and emotions. Prolonged exposure therapy uses repeated, detailed imaging of the trauma in a safe, controlled way to help the person face and gain control of fear and learn to cope. Stress inculcation therapy aims to arm the individual with the necessary coping skills to successfully defend against stressful triggers through the exposure of milder levels of stress. Group therapy encourages survivors of similar traumatic events to share their experiences and reactions in a comfortable, non-judgmental setting. Group members help one another realize that many people would have responded the same way and felt the same emotions. And medications that can help control the symptoms of PTSD. Some antidepressants such as SSRIs and SNRIs, which are commonly used to treat the core symptoms of PTSD. And right here we have a list of common anti-anxiety medications used, atypical antidepressants, and the SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Here I have a quote from psychotherapist Edward Tick from the Our Culture as Medicine article. Native American traditions recognize that the wound is fundamentally a wound to the soul, a spiritual crisis, and the problem that needs to be responded to with specifically designated healing practices for warriors. And it needs to happen in a tribal context or community context, which leads us into our native treatments. The native treatments that are typically used for PTSD or trauma are powwows, music, storytelling, smudging, and a pipe ceremony. So we have the pipe ceremony here. All of these. So a powwow is a combination of the sacred and social gathering of Native people in a circular arena with Native dancing, singing, and drumming. Dancing and wearing regalia in an expression of solidarity and identity as a Native American. This type of healing is crucial in relation to the historical trauma mentioned in earlier slides. Music closely ties into powwows. Drumming and singing are important parts of most healing ceremonies. Research suggests that drumming can stimulate different psychological responses that have mystical implications within spiritual traditions. Indigenous stories of healing are as valid as any of modern Western medical science and offer means to understand the uniqueness of experience of the healing process for the individual. Such stories can offer faith and hope in the healing process to those suffering, and the stories themselves serve as medicine and contribute to healing. Smudging is a way of purification. It is usually done by passing the smoke of burning sage, sweetgrass, or cedar over individuals and throughout spaces. Smudging can facilitate the healing process as negative energy is drawn away and beneficial energy is drawn in. Pipe ceremony. A sacred pipe bowl, which is traditionally made from red kaolite, and the stem is made from a hardwood, is the main part of the ceremony. A mixture of herbs such as red, willow, sage, and tobacco is used in the pipe and smoked. The ceremony is said to help an individual gain peace and relief from suffering while participating in the ceremony. And here we just have the works cited. thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.